The McKeon family from County Louth, Ireland, board a Coffin ship to escape the grips of the Great Hunger.
My daddy rode a coffin ship across the angry sea. He left the place to crown a race for a better life for me.
Left without a choice, they unknowingly trade one cruel life with another.
It seems the devil builds a boat for every man to ride.
So the whole story with Jimmy McKeon actually starts with his parents making a run for it from Ireland to America. His mother and father, Anne and Matthew, were believed to be from the Drogheda and Talonstown area respectively. They got married in Dublin in 1845, right as the famine was tearing apart the country, which meant they had to run to survive. But where to? When the song says he pawned a fiddle, a lot of people around this time would sell absolutely everything they had to afford tickets to the United States. And in a lot of cases, they wouldn't have enough for one ticket. So one person would usually go over to the United States, work and send money home, and bring the rest of the family over later on. But anyway, however they got their hands on the money to afford a ticket, they ended up on one of those coffin ships to get to New York, just hoping for a fair shot at life. But things took a turn for the worse pretty much as soon as they landed. They were living in the 5 Points, which was a rough enough spot back then, and Matthew tragically died in 1849. Jimmy was only a baby, maybe a year old. It's very likely that his dad was caught up in that massive cholera outbreak that killed thousands in the city that year. Just a tough start for them. But it wasn't even going to get much easier anytime soon. So Jimmy had it fairly rough growing up. He was just a small lad when his father passed away, leaving his mother Anne to raise him and his sisters all on her own in the slums. They were squeezed together into these tiny tenement buildings over on Lawrence Street. Back then, New York was absolutely bursting at the seams. To keep up, people were taking old family houses and chopping them up into these tiny little narrow apartments just to cram more people in. You can only imagine the state of them as well. Dark, falling apart, and had no proper air or plumbing to speak of. They were basically just a breeding ground for sickness. It was a grim enough place to spend your childhood for sure. Growing up in a spot like that, Jimmy had absolutely nothing to his name. No money, no leg up, nothing but his own hard work to get him through. It's actually interesting looking at the records now as well, because nobody could even agree on when he was born. You'd see 1847 in one place and then 1849 or 1851 in another. He spent years later on just trying to prove his own age for his pension. But we'll get to that later. Living like that really pushed him into what happened next. When you're stuck in the mud of the New York slums, and options are thin on the ground, the military looks like a grand way out. So he joined the Navy in 1864 while he was only a teenager. So let's reflect back. A life torn apart in Ireland, shipped over to New York in a coffin ship, losing your father, evading disease, and now your only option left to move forward is war.
Before I ever kissed a girl or understood the cost, I was sailing south, mouthing off, counting up the loss. And they raised the stars and stripes on that Carolina shore. We were kids, new Americans, living through a war.
To give you a bit of context on what Jimmy was actually caught up in, and for anyone who doesn't know much about the American Civil War, I myself am still learning, so please do let me know if anything interesting has been left out, or maybe you have a similar story to share that might align with this. It'll just add to the whole thing. The American Civil War was basically the whole country tearing itself in two. You had the North, the Union, fighting to keep the states together and end slavery, while the South, the Confederacy, wanted to go their own way to keep things exactly as they were. But anyway, the Union had this plan called the Anaconda Plan, where they wanted to wrap around the Confederates and choke off their supplies. That's where Jimmy's ship, the USS Chicopee, comes in. It was this clever wooden gunboat with paddle wheels on both sides, meaning it could go forward or backward without having to turn around. Because it didn't sit deep in the water, it was perfect for sneaking into the narrow rivers and shallow spots around North Carolina to keep the blockade tight. But the Confederates had a bit of a monster up their sleeve, the CSS Albemarle. This was a massive ironclad ship literally covered in thick iron plates. They actually built it in a cornfield using whatever scrap metal they could find, even old frying pans and plows. It was terrifying because the Union's cannonballs would practically bounce right off of it. It had already sank one ship and was basically ruling the river. Since they couldn't sink it with normal guns, and they had first sent in a sister boat of the Chicopee, the USS Sassacus, to try and sink it, but that failed. The Union then sent in a lad named Lieutenant William Cushing on a bit of a suicide mission. He took a tiny boat out into the pitch black, snuck past the defences, and blew the iron monster sky high with a torpedo. And that brings us back to Jimmy. From his obituary, you'll see here, he was the lookout that night, watching the whole thing go down. And when Cushing ended up in the freezing river after the explosion, it was Jimmy's boat crew that rowed out and pulled him to safety. Pretty heroic stuff for a young lad from the tenements.
You heard about the night that they drove old Dixie down. Well, I was on the water when they blew a hole into the ram. Spotted a circle of huge logs, a monster slept inside. Billy went with Cushing, another teenage suicide. They blew a hole so big that the devil shook his head. One Bill will tell a story, one Bill will end up dead.
After all that madness with the Confederate ship, you have to remember why a young lad like Jimmy was even there in the first place. He joined the Navy in 1864, basically just to get away from the hunger and the dirt of those New York tenements. He told them that he was 15, and from what I've learned is that younger teenagers could enlist to assist the front lines, like carrying equipment, weapons, gunpowder. Powder monkey was a name given to some, but Jimmy was enlisted and was a proud seaman, as it shows on his grave. Looking back at the dates that Tim found, Jimmy could have been even younger than that. Not uncommon for the time, but to know the exact age is a puzzle. About a fifth of the whole Union Navy was made up of Irish fellas just like him, trying to find a way to survive and get a foot on the ladder in the new country. And that's just the Navy as well. During his 3 years at sea, he really saw it all. Being the lookout who spotted the Albemarle in the dead of night was a massive deal. Especially that mission to blow it up was nearly a suicide job for everybody involved. But it wasn't just a ship. Jimmy was actually credited with catching 2 enemy spies as well. Between that and rowing out into the freezing Roanoke River to save Lieutenant Cushing after the explosion, he ended up with a pile of citations for being a brave skin. He finally finished up his service and got an honourable discharge in December 1866, having done more by his teens than most men do in their entire life. After the war was over, you'd think that the government would have made things easy for a man who'd done so much, but it was anything but. Jimmy ended up in a massive scrap with the Bureau of Pensions that dragged on for years. Since he was just a young lad from a poor immigrant family, when he signed up, there was no birth certificate or anything like that in the city records. He'd likely lied about his age as well just to get in. Nobody knows for sure. So when he was trying to get his pension increased between 1909 and 1911, the bureaucrats wouldn't believe how old he actually was. He had to fight them tooth and nail, arguing that if the Navy was happy to say that he was 15 when he was dodging cannonballs, they should be happy to take it as gospel now, which is a very fair point. It's a bit heartbreaking though when you look at the bigger picture of his life. That war was the first time he risked everything for a future in America, but it wasn't the last. He eventually moved to a place called Peekskill and traded the dangers of the sea for 40 years of back-breaking work. He spent his days in an iron foundry, packing wet sand in heat that would hit 100 degrees. He basically gave up his health and his body to that foundry just to make sure that his children and their kids wouldn't have to grow up in the same dirt that he had to. He paid the price in the war and then paid it all over again in the factories, all just to break that cycle of poverty for good.
I came home to a dirty city, ghosts inside my head. If I stayed, I'd just end up another rabbit laying dead. So I sailed again without my friend up the river that flows both ways, and I sunk my feet in the muddy streets along the Peekskill Bay.
Once he got his discharge papers in 1866, Jimmy wasn't about to go back to those miserable slums in the city. He headed north up the Hudson River. It was a fresh start, but like I said, He was really just swapping the rough seas for a different kind of hardship. That move kicked off a massive 50-year chapter of his life, where he was either working himself to the bone or fighting the authorities for what he was owed. Back then, Peekskill was the place to be if you were making cast iron stoves. Now Jimmy here, he spent 40 years as an iron moulder and a foreman at the Southard Robertson Company here. It was a huge industry, but the work was absolute torture. To get an idea of how big the industry actually was, some talk around the area that during World War II, an American soldier found a Peekskill stove in the Black Forest of Germany. Closer to home, there's even a Peekskill stove in the remade cabin of Henry Thoreau, which is where he lived when he wrote the classic Walden. You can't even imagine the toll that took on a man. For 4 decades, he was stuck in those foundries, his face constantly covered in soot. There's actually an old photo from 1902 of the crew at the foundry, and you can see him right here. It's a powerful image because you can see the hard life that he had lived written all over.
Got a job casting stoves, breathing in the shit. I met a girl from County Clare, and we had a bunch of kids. Had to fight for every penny that the Navy owed to me. Had to drink the demons gone just to get some sleep.
Even with the work being a total killer, those years in Peekskill were really the first time that Jimmy got a bit of solid ground under his feet. He finally had the kind of stability his own parents never got a chance at during the famine. He got married to a girl named Mary Ann McLaughlin in 1880 at the local church, and they had set up a proper home on John Street. They didn't do things by halves either. They ended up with a massive house full of at least 10 kids. You can see in the old local papers that he was right in the middle of everything in the town as well. He wasn't just working, he was out at community events, like the time he won a turkey at a Thanksgiving shoot with the local fire company, or when he was competing in rifle contests on Washington's birthday. After everything he's been through, it's nice to think of him finally having a bit of a life for himself and a family to come home to.
And we finally found the family home, 602 John Street, where all the kids have grown. My father gave me fertile ground, a life that's worth the fight. And I'll drink to all the boys that never made it back that cold dark night. Yeah, I'll drink to all the boys that never made it back that cold dark night.
He didn't actually pack it in until about 10 years before he passed away at 1922. When you look back at it all, that long career in the foundry was the ultimate sacrifice for the next generation. Think about it for a second. He survived the famine as a baby, grew up without a father in the worst slums in New York, and then literally bled for the country and the Navy. But instead of catching a break, he spent the rest of his life feeding his health into those blazing furnaces in Peekskill. He did it all so his 10 kids wouldn't have to face the same hunger that he did. He finally got that stability he was looking for, staying put on John Street with Mary Ann and making sure his family had a proper roof over their heads and a chance at a better life. He really was the one who broke the cycle for them. But some really interesting bits of folklore about Peekskill that's just too cool to leave out here. Firstly, Abraham Lincoln himself stopped by here during the Civil War to give a speech. But what's cooler than the president giving a speech? Crayons. Yes, Crayola actually has its roots here in Peekskill. They were originally called the Peekskill Chemical Works, well before any kid had a crayon stuck up their nose. They later renamed to Binney and Smith, and even then, no crayons. They were famous for making the red pigment that gave American barns their classic colour, and the carbon black that turned car tyres from white to black. But the first Crayola crayon wasn't sold until 1903, and it was Edwin Binney's wife who came up with the name Crayola. But enough about crayons, though. As well, Frank Baum, the author of Wizard of Oz, you know, the book with the yellow brick road in it, with the tornado that teleports Dorothy? Well, he attended the Peekskill Military Academy from 1868 to 1870, and historians in the area uncovered an old brick road that led from the river all the way up to the academy, which potentially might be the inspiration for the yellow brick road in the book. No concrete proof though from what I've heard, but it's still absolutely cool nonetheless.
And they raised the stars and stripes on that Carolina shore. We were kids, new Americans, living through a war. You heard about the night that they drove old Dixie down. Well, I was on the water when they blew a hole into the ram. Yeah, I was on the water when they blew a hole into the ram.
Jimmy's real legacy is a massive win for his family, but it came at a high price. He eventually passed away at his home on John Street in April 1922. His health was fairly well spent by then, which isn't a shock after the life that he had put in. Only a few days after Jimmy died, his son Matthew wrote to the pension office to sort out his father's final payment. The best part is that he wrote the letter on his own official business paper. He had his own shop, J. McKeon, Groceries and Vegetables, right on Main Street. That right there is the whole point of Jimmy's life. He took the hits so his son could stand behind the counter in his own shop. Instead of breathing in soot for a living, he paid the price so they could finally walk a different path, even though he spent the years fighting those pencil pushers in the government just to get his proper pension. Jimmy was always incredibly proud of his time in the Navy. You know how some fellas come back from a war and never say a word? Well, Jimmy was the opposite. He must have told his stories with real heart, because when he passed away in 1922, his obituary was full of his heroics. His kids clearly knew how much it meant to him too. They put up a massive stone cross at his grave in Assumption Cemetery and made sure to carve Seaman USS Chicopee right into the monument so nobody would ever forget. The best part is that this story didn't just end right there in the graveyard. His great-great-grandson, Tim Feeney, who wrote the song titled Jimmy McKeon 1864 that you've heard throughout the video, he did a massive amount of research for it, covering everything from the famine and to the slums to the naval battles and those roasting foundries in Peekskill. This video wouldn't have been possible without him. When you also realise that the song was written in his grandfather Jim McKeon's house, where he is currently raising the 6th generation right there in Peekskill, where Jimmy set it all up, and that the song was recorded in a studio just 500 feet from where the foundry was. It really gives a sense of permanence to the whole thing. Like, the history isn't just a story anymore. It's part of the house and the earth that the studio was built on. And when you take a step back and look at how close this whole thing came to never happening, it's a massive butterfly effect when you really think about it. The song, by the way, is out right now, so check out the description for links to them. You can listen to it in full without me rambling away. There will also be an official music video coming out as well that Tim is working on, so whenever that's released, I'll drop a post on the channel to keep you all updated. But make sure to subscribe as well so you don't miss out on it. All the links as well will be in the description to help you get to where you need. An absolute ton of work was put into putting this song together, and the video as well. So I genuinely hope you enjoy it just as much as I did. And with that, I'll leave you all to it. Slán go fóill. Cheers. Woo!